Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new installment of our department's research seminar. That's the Department for Theoretical Philosophy at the University of Bucharest. And the research seminar is organized jointly with CELFIS, that's the Center for Logic, Philosophy, and History of Science at the University of Bucharest, and ICUB, that's the research institute at the same university, and specifically the Humanities Division. And I'm delighted to see Professor Jalobanu in the audience. She's chairing that division. The research seminar is organized thanks to a postdoctoral grant granted by WFISCDI, that's the local public funding agency for research. And the code for the project via which the series is supported is PN-3 Roman dash P1 dash 1.1 dash PD dash 2019-0535, and we're very grateful to our public sponsor. Tonight's speaker is none other than Hasok Chang from the University of Cambridge. Professor Chang needs no introduction. He is quite well known. He is one of the spearheads of integrating history and philosophy of science, of integrating theoretical views in HPS and the philosophy of practice, of integrating the metaphysics of science and metamethodology. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to welcome him here. And Hasok, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Andre, for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. I think it was almost exactly 4 years ago when I made my one and only visit to Bucharest so far, thanks to Dana and colleagues. And it would have been so nice to be able to come and be with you in person. But this is also nice. We get to see various other people from other places. And I think it's something, this way of working is something we can carry forward from the pandemic, rather than simply going back to how it used to be. So very, very glad to be here. But I do remember very fondly being physically in Bucharest, and there was a wonderful snowstorm, and yeah, I hope to be back. So let me now share my slides, and oh, that's getting ahead of me. Right. So I hope you can all see that well enough. And if anything goes wrong, please do find a way of letting me know. I hope my internet will be stable, but here we go. Is give you a slice of my forthcoming book, which is called Realism for Realistic People. It's an attempt to introduce more pragmatism, a different kind of pragmatism slightly, to the philosophy of science. And what you're going to hear today is just a sketch of chapter 3, which is on reality. It's not a kind of topic that I usually try to speak about. Some of you who know my work know that usually my work is very closely tied to history of science, and in any case, some concrete scientific details. And so this whole book is an anomaly for me. It's quite an abstract book, although examples, sort of like Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, has all kinds of brief examples, but no detailed study of any particular episodes. So that's the flavor of it. And the general aim I have in this work is to build on work by many other people, not least of all Sandy Mitchell, sitting in this Zoom room, to make a philosophy of science that is fit for understanding and facilitating scientific practices. So the general notion I'm advancing there is that we should pay attention to what I'm calling active knowledge seen as an ability to do things knowing how to do things, rather than the traditional analytical perspective, according to which knowledge consists in propositions and hopefully true propositions. So part of what I try to do is to show how propositional knowledge functions within active knowledge. So that's the bigger picture, but today I'm just going to give you one slice, of course. Now, in this line of work, I initially tried my best to avoid anything metaphysical, but eventually I gave up on that because I recognized the need to answer this question. What is knowledge about? What is it that we have knowledge of? Now, when it comes to empirical knowledge, the traditional intuition is that we do have, or we should try to have, knowledge about reality, right? So we seek to know facts, which are states of reality. Now that makes perfect sense for propositional knowledge, but what are objects of active knowledge, as I call it? And here too, in the end, I think we come back to the idea of reality, in the sense that active knowledge is a matter of our ability to engage productively with reality. So these vague thoughts need to be articulated more closely, and that I concluded that requires having an appropriate sense of what reality is. So I couldn't, in the end, avoid something that looked like metaphysics. So in ordinary English, reality is just a noun form of real. So why not start by considering what it actually means in practice when we say something is real, roughly in the sense of existing or actual. Now, philosophical debates about reality, I think, should connect with the concrete methods by which people reach real-life judgments of what is real. But you know very well that in all the discussion of realism in metaphysics and in the philosophy of science, it is quite rare that any concrete criteria for reality are laid down. In fact, standard versions of metaphysical realism, as articulated by Tim Button, for example, or advocated by Tim Maudlin, expressly remove any inherent connection between metaphysical truth or reality and the operational procedures of scientific and everyday inquiry. So in that light, Ian Hacking's so-called experimental realism or entity realism was considered refreshing because of the departure he made from that tradition, when he famously declared, if you can spray them, then they are real. This, as some of you know very well, was a reference to positrons. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with that part of Hacking's work, this is the example he was looking at, a modern version of Millikan's oil drop experiment, in which Millikan, for the first time, measured precisely the elementary unit of electric charge. To cut a long story short, what Millikan did was to change the amount of electric charge that an oil drop suspended in air would hold, and that changed the motion of this oil drop moving up and down, subject to two forces, right? One was the gravitational pull down, and the other was electrostatic force, which Millikan had superimposed upon the gravitational. So by seeing the changes in the motion of the oil drops, Millikan could tell, I have put on an electron on this oil drop, and that was the minimal amount of change of motion. So Hacking tells us that a physicist colleague of his at Stanford University, when he was teaching there, showed him a fancy version of this experiment in which the charge on the oil drop, actually it was a little ball of niobium metal in that case, the electric charge was changed not by putting electrons on the thing or removing electrons, but by putting positrons on it, in which case the charge became more positive. And Hacking threw up his hands and said, okay, fine. If you can spray these positrons onto a little ball of something and change the way it moves, then these positrons must be real. So the lesson is to get a sense of the concrete and operational meaning of reality, we must pay proper attention to our practices. Now, this is what I take to be the spirit of pragmatism, although Hacking himself denies being a pragmatist. I also work to a point in the spirit of the ordinary language philosophy as advocated by J.L. Austin. Here's a nice passage from Austin where he says, our common stock of words embodies all the distinctions people have found worth drawing and the connections that they have found worth making in the lifetimes of many generations. These surely are likely to be more sound since they have stood up to the long test of the survival of the fittest, and more subtle, at least in all ordinary and reasonably practical matters, more so than any that you or I are likely to think up in our armchairs on an afternoon, the most favored alternative method. Okay, linguistic and scientific practices are surely not infallible guides to philosophizing, but they are sources for plausible insights worth examining. Paying attention to them is as good a starting point as any in epistemology, and with clear implications for metaphysics as well. Now, in everyday life, we do routinely make judgments of what is real, right? Treating some things as real and others as not real is a very important part of how we live. Scientists do the same, though they may not often invoke the terminology of reality in expressing their judgments, preferring to talk about statistical significance and such things. Now, within concrete practices of all kinds, we know very well how to judge what is real and what is not, arriving at verdicts like ghosts aren't real, or the Loch Ness monster isn't real in everyday life, and the placebo effect is real, or antimatter is real in more scientific context. And the quotidian and scientific context often merge together. Consider, for example, PET scans in medical diagnosis, the positron emission tomography. Now, this, I think, is the most amazing thing that people don't even realize how amazing they are. And how these PET scans work. In fact, I learned in Bucharest 4 years ago, not from any of you guys, but from Rick Shang, who was speaking in one of the workshops, and that was the topic of his PhD, and he explained it very nicely, that what you do in PET scans is inject the patient's body with certain radioisotopes, right, which decay and emit positrons. And the positrons would immediately meet electrons in the surrounding area, and they would do the pair annihilation, turning into a pair of gamma rays, which then you can detect to triangulate the location of where that positron had been emitted. And why this is useful for diagnosis is because various types of tissue absorb these radioisotopes differently, right? So particular tissues are very fond of these radioisotope containing molecules, and then the scan can show where that kind of tissue is, and it'll show you tumors, it'll show you all kinds of interesting things. So if you can spray positrons into your own body and have that affect how you're going to be treated by doctors, well, I mean, that's a very nice merger of the quotidian and scientific context. Some cases are more uncertain, especially at the cutting edge of science. something like dark matter, we're not so sure about. And there's a curious case here I'm showing you of the mesozone, long believed to be a real entity that's within bacterial cells, which turned out to be an artifact of the chemical fixation process used to prepare the cells for electron microscopy in the early days. So that's something I learned from my friend and colleague, Nick Rasmussen, who has this wonderful paper. Or consider the history of N-rays, mesmerism, or the Little Ice Age, and so on. But when scientists have uncertainties about specific answers to real or not questions in practice, they know very well how to go about deciding the answers, while admitting that their judgments are fallible in the same way as any other scientific judgments. In all these situations, no one seems to be confused about what being real means, even when there are disagreements about answers to specific questions. So one underlying question here is, why is it so hard for us philosophers when we try to get a sense of what it means to be real? And now let us try to articulate more carefully what is involved in our notion of something being real in these concrete situations. So I am now trying to do some philosophy about the concrete situations. When we say something like the placebo effect is real, we are expressing our judgment that the named thing is operative in some processes. Its existence is a difference that makes a difference, as the pragmatists like to say. When physicists say that positrons are real, or when we say that dogs and cats are real, that means that there are meaningful and effective things one can do with them. I propose this definition as the core of what I call a coherence theory of reality. Reality meaning being real. An entity is real to the extent that there are operationally coherent activities that can be performed by relying significantly on its existence and its properties. Now you will immediately be asking, well, what on earth do I mean by operational coherence? And that can be summed up as an aim-oriented coordination in an activity. So this all comes up in the context of me trying to make sense of what I'm calling active knowledge, right? What does it mean for us to know something true in terms of how we know how to do things? How does truth and this kind of sense of coherence relate? I won't go into truth today, but that's how this all came up, and now I'm applying the way of thinking to reality. So roughly speaking, operational coherence is a harmonious fitting together of elements and aspects of an activity which is conducive to the successful achievement of the aims of that activity. A coherent activity is one that is well designed for the achievement of its aims, even though it cannot be expected to be successful in each and every instance. Operational coherence is based on a pragmatic sort of understanding. It consists in doing what makes sense to do in specific situations of purposive action. Now, this kind of coordination is familiar to all of us in simple daily activities, such as drinking water, lighting a match, climbing stairs. And the same can be seen in complex scientific and technological systems, such as the global positioning system that we've all got so used to using without even thinking about what a massive and weird, complex undertaking it is, flying all these geosynchronous satellites, sending electromagnetic signals back and forth between those satellites and locations on Earth, and running at atomic clocks on those satellites to get the precise differences of the travel times of the signals, and correcting those atomic clocks using general relativity and special relativity, and then beaming the signals down to our phones and other devices, and then we have to integrate that with our walking around. It's an amazing feat of scientific, technological, and daily activities coming all very weirdly and amazingly together. Now, that's operational coherence in a very small nutshell. Coming back to the notion of reality itself, when I say that an activity relies on an entity, the sense of reliance here is not one of metaphysical necessity, but of actual use and actual need. I think this definition of reality, again, as realness, is consonant with many well-established quotidian and scientific uses of the word, and it can also do very useful philosophical work in spelling out what realism should mean in the context of empiricism and pragmatism. Now, I'm going to pause and stress that what I'm making here is a semantic move, in the sense that it concerns the very meaning of the word real. I am not proposing operational coherence just as an indication of metaphysical reality, which serves as evidence that something is real. Rather, it is about what we mean by something being real, and I suggest that there isn't anything else that being real means in an operational sense. One might say that I'm proposing a constitutive criterion of realness rather than an epistemic criterion. To draw a rough analogy, if you ask me, how do you tell if you have a headache? Then the answer is, of course, I check if my head hurts. But that doesn't mean that a pain in the head is a symptom of a headache. No, a headache is a pain felt in the head. That's what it means. There isn't some platonic thing called headache in capital letters out there, of which the hurt feeling in my head is merely a symptom or manifestation, right? So it's different from saying, oh, I have migraine and the pain in the head is a symptom of it. If we mean just headache, well, that is pain in the head. Likewise, I'm proposing that we use the term real to mean having the capacity to support coherent activities, in which case it would be misleading to say that an entity is able to support coherent activities because it's real. That kind of causal talk would only add an unilluminating and intractable type of metaphysical layer to our thinking, kind of metaphysics that I'm still trying to avoid. Now, you may be worried that my proposal distorts or perverts the meaning of reality too greatly. This is a legitimate kind of concern, which can be debated further, but first of all, let me make sure that the nature of my proposal is conveyed clearly. I'm not claiming that the definition of real I'm proposing here encompasses every existing usage of that word. Rather, I am proposing that the capacity to support coherent activities is what we should mean by real. Why? Because I think it will be conducive to productive discourse while being reasonably faithful to a variety of actual usage currently embedded in various practices. So what I'm engaged in can be seen as a project of explication as conceived by Carnap, or an attempt at conceptual engineering, in an idiom that's become quite fashionable these days. Whatever you call it, the important point is to recognize that we have some choice in what we mean by a term. So we could decide to postulate an unobservable disease entity called headache, whose one and only symptom is pain in the head. But we need to ask, would that be a productive move? What useful function would that kind of concept serve? So any semantic proposal of this sort is to be judged by its fruits, because ultimately there is no higher court of appeal. This is again my general pragmatism showing. Now, we should, of course, also address the epistemic question of how we know if something is real. So according to my meaning, we have first-hand knowledge that an entity is real if we personally know how to perform some of these operationally coherent activities that rely significantly on the entity's existence and its properties. And if we are aware of some activities that other people can perform, then we have second-hand knowledge of the reality of the entity in question. If there are coherent activities that someone can perform relying on the entity in question, but we're not aware of this, then the entity is real, but we don't know that it's real. So distinguishing the definition of reality from the epistemic conditions for reality, I think should reassure those who fear that my conception makes the existence of external reality dependent on our subjective knowledge of it. So the knowledge of reality and reality itself can be clearly distinguished under my conception. So yes, I can say that a tree does fall in the forest even if no one is there to hear the sound and all of that. I think when normal people say, of course the tree fell even though there was no one to hear it, they mean that anyone present would have heard the noise, that anyone standing on the unfortunate side of that tree would have been crushed, that we can now go and see that the tree has fallen on the ground, and so on. All these operational things. Now, you philosophers may mean something additional and fancier by the tree really falling, but in that case, whatever you are asserting there is not obviously the case. The realness of an entity or an event is a matter of whether there are coherent activities it can support, not a matter of whether our current community of people can and will actually perform such activities. So yes, something can indeed be real without us knowing anything about it. And our lack of knowledge does not, of course, make anything non-existent. So all of that is just to initially fend off people, realists who might really be worried that I am going deeply into idealism. No, I'm not, at least not in that crude sense. Still, I expect many people will be uncomfortable with the idea that realness depends in any way on what we think or do. Consider, for example, what I'm going to call the inaccessibility argument for metaphysical realism, which encompasses the so-called argument from the past. This argument works by pointing to entities that seem inaccessible to us human inquirers, yet also seem undeniably real. So if there are such entities, then there are real entities, even if there could be no human cognition or activity involving them. So favorite examples, surely dinosaurs were real, and so were the asteroid or comet whose impact 66 million years ago wiped out the dinosaurs. But there were no humans then, so there were no performable activities involving the dinosaurs or the asteroid. Then, according to my definition, do I not have to deny the reality of these entities? Again, in response, I would first of all point out that it is not the case that we in the present are completely lacking in the knowledge of those inaccessible entities, because there are coherent present activities that we can perform by relying on the comet's past existence and properties, such as identifying its traces in geological strata, which we do. If we can engage in a coherent explanatory activity as well, involving the comet colliding with the Earth in the distant past and causing mass extinctions, or engage in a coherent observational and classificatory activity involving dinosaur fossils and so on, then we are beginning to have some knowledge of the reality of the comet and the dinosaurs. And how else can it make sense to say that scientists know that such things are real? And why else are we actually so sure that there were such things as dinosaurs in the past? And so it goes with other kinds of situations of inaccessibility too. such as entities in a distant corner of the universe that we can never reach, or black holes that we can never actually see. It really is not the case that we have to be in the same spatio-temporal location with an entity in order to be engaging with it in coherent activities. Even when I'm just looking at an ordinary object not far away, you could quibble and say that the interaction is actually indirect, since it involves photons bouncing off the object and being received by my eyes and causing complicated nerve signals. You could also point out that actually the information conveyed to my mind is about something that existed in the past, because the photon leaving the nearby object takes a little time to reach my eyes. But I don't think anything of philosophical significance follows from such points. Sure, we cannot really go to the near past cat that I see walking down the road, but what of it? And this is just a very mild version of the inaccessibility of the dinosaurs of the distant past that I cannot take a time machine to go see. I also cannot take a time machine to go see the cat whose emission of photons I receive in my eyes. The cat has given me observable traces, and so have the dinosaurs. I judge them both to be real, as would the metaphysical realist. So no one has scored a point through that argument. Now, a related worry is going to be that there seems to be a kind of constructivism in my view of real entities. Doesn't my definition deprive reality of its mind independence? Here is helpful to disambiguate the notion of mind independence by distinguishing mind control and mind framing, as I will call them. So the valid realist intuition, which I fully share, is that by mere thinking, we do not decide how reality is. So the issue there is mind control. Our minds do not have direct willful control over any reality outside ourselves. Reality does not obey our commands. I think we can all agree about that. But mind framing, which is about our conceptualization of entities, is a wholly different issue from mind control. Whenever we designate an entity by a concept, the entity is framed by the concept, which resides in our minds or in our languages. So I want to propose the following as the new realist common sense. All entities are mind framed, but only a small portion of them are mind controlled. Real entities are mind framed simply because all entities are mind framed. All that we can ever think or talk about are mind framed entities. This is a fundamentally Kantian insight which I preserve. As Hilary Putnam once put it in a very impactful tautology, the world is not describable independently of our description. On the other hand, not being subject to mind control is an important hallmark of reality. This accords with a common ordinary language sense of reality as well. The first definition of reality given by my trusty Collins English Dictionary is, quote, the state of things as they are or appear to be, rather than as one might wish them to be, unquote. So real entities are, at least in some respects, mind uncontrolled. Even when they do something that pleases us, they are not doing as we please. Even something that we define in a purely conventional way cannot be controlled as we wish. Take constellations. After we fancifully connect up a certain group of stars as Orion or the Big Dipper or whatever, we still cannot dictate what shape the group will have a million years later, when the individual stars will have moved around. That is to say, even though Orion is obviously a mind-framed entity, it is not mind-controlled. So the question of reality is not a question about unqualified mind independence. contrary to the common metaphysical realist way of thinking. I would stress that the constructivism that is inherent in my pragmatist view of reality is not anything that should worry those who seek empirical knowledge, any more than empiricists should fear Bas van Frassen's constructive empiricism. The presence of a concept is a prerequisite for there being any specifiable entity that we can speak or think about. However, we cannot create reality just by creating a new concept. We can make concepts as we like, but whether the entities they specify turn out to be real is not up to us. If we do manage to create a new concept that designates an entity with which we can engage in coherent activities, then that is a successful inventive process. Now, this process deserves to be called invention more than discovery, as some of you may recall from the title of my first book, Inventing Temperature. And that was a title given by Oxford Press. And the minute they sent me that, I said, yes, that's it. That's much better than my own title. So the process deserves to be invention more than discovery, but its success is not in our control. And that is just the same in the technological processes of invention as well. So Marconi did not simply conjure up wireless telegraphy in any arbitrary way he fancied. The coherence of his operations was a great achievement precisely because there was no guarantee of that coherence. So we propose and nature disposes, as people have sometimes said. Now, there are some other things which I would discuss for you, including the question of whether there can be reality from purely mental activities, but I'm going to skip through those parts. In the interest of time, I can certainly come to them in the question period. The short answer to that question is yes, but not in a way that should worry anyone, I would argue. But let me shift to the shorter second part of this talk, which is about another sense of reality. So I've so far discussed what it means for an entity to be real, right? So reality as realness. But now let me address the different sense of reality, which is the more usual subject matter of metaphysical discourse, namely the thing that exists out there, the external world, and so on. So I propose to take this concept too in the most humble and concrete way possible. Let us take realities simply to be entities that are real. With this meaning, reality is a countable noun, and reality without an article in front of it is not grammatical, unlike reality that means realness. Now, I think it is a knowing that reality as the noun form of the adjective real is ambiguous in its meaning, but the two meanings as I propose to take them, meaning realness and something that is real, these two meanings are easily consonant with each other. And many other English nouns formed from adjectives also exhibit the same duality, right? So, for example, absurdity means both absurdness and something that is absurd. So at the end of this hour, you might go away and say that talk was an absurdity because it had a lot of absurdity to it. Now, it may be slightly awkward to say things like a sparrow is a reality, but if that is weird, then you can simply spell it out as real entity each time. Now, my dictionary, which I quoted already, gives these following definitions for reality. I quoted the first one earlier. Right? Here I'm picking up definitions 3 and 2 in blue as the chief meanings of reality, and I'm proposing to understand the other ones on the basis of these two. Now, all of this might be quite a letdown to the deep metaphysical mind, if there are any of those people out there in this audience. I know my notion here doesn't sit well with the kind of reality that many philosophers like to talk about. The notion of the world, the external world, the reality, or reality with a capital R, the totality of existence. But I have difficulty thinking of any coherent activities that would involve reality with the capital R in that sense. What would you do with that notion, in fact? Such a grandiose notion only occurs in the kind of metaphysical, religious, or mystical discourse that I wouldn't know how to engage in sensibly and will not enter into in print, at least. I think we would do well to avoid thinking in terms of a totalizing kind of reality, at least in most contexts, because it is a much too lofty construction with no concrete operational purchase, which does not meaningfully designate any particular thing. German philosopher Marcus Gabriel makes a playful yet significant point when he argues that something exists only when it is found in the world. So the world cannot in principle exist because it is not found in the world. Perhaps more palatable for most philosophers would be Nicholas Rescher's point that terms such as the world, the universe, the true facts, and so on are mere placeholders, vacuous unifiers designating an inherently empty container into which we can put anything and everything. It is very difficult to make sense of the claim that the world is real according to my notion of realness based on operational coherence. There isn't anything we can do with the external world as a whole. Can we even talk meaningfully and usefully about the whole of reality? Really, what is the world? I don't actually know what that means when I think about it. And I've always had trouble even pronouncing the word correctly. And I think some disambiguation is helpful here too. Now, I understand very well what the world means in phrases like the World Health Organization or somebody being world champion, as a collection of all the countries or other kinds of human communities. So in my native language, which is Korean, there are different words for these different meanings. So the first one is this word 세계, comes from Chinese roots, classical Chinese roots, the way English words often come from Latin and Greek roots. So if you know Chinese, that's the origin of this learned word. Similarly, the world might mean the earth, the planet, as when we talk about the climate map of the world or that kind of thing. And that's a separate word in Korean called jigu. Literally, in the etymology, the earth ball, that's what that means. But Anglophone philosophers have a habit of saying world to mean something more like the universe or the cosmos, right? Which is this one in Korean, 우주. In everyday context, hardly anyone would think of translating English world into this word in Korean. On reflection, it's really not clear what it is that we philosophers have in mind when we talk about the world. If you think that this is a straightforward matter, you can tell me whether the world includes God in it. Even when cosmologists theorize about the universe, it is only particular aspects of the universe conceptualized in very specific ways, not just all that there is. So I find it difficult to see how we can achieve any sensible aims through the kind of move exemplified by what some people actually do, which is to write the big Greek letter psi for the quantum wave function of the whole universe. I've never witnessed anything useful coming out of that move. It's not easy to avoid talking about the grand universe scale notion of reality completely, but I think we should try. It reminds me of old Nelson Goodman, right, who was at pains to stress that all that we can ever actually deal with are what he called versions of the world. And even Goodman's way of talking is only a ladder to be kicked away once we have climbed it, I think, because versions of the world is a phrase that inevitably raises the expectation that there is such a thing as the world of which we make versions. That invites the accusation that Goodman is denying the reality of the evidently existent underlying world. So I think that that's in the end a misleading way of talking. And I think the current perspectivists have the same problem when they say, we take different perspectives on the world. Okay, then why shouldn't we try to get at the world? And we collapse into the same old arguments which the perspectivists are really trying to avoid. So let me come to the concluding part now with some reflections on the nature of the work I am trying to do with these thoughts that I'm sharing with you today. So I'm not proposing to reform our conception of reality just for the sake of it, or because I think my definition is really correct and other definitions are not. I'm trying to make a contribution to pragmatist metaphysics, to borrow a phrase from Sami Pihlström, a Finnish philosopher that I have great respect for. In order to have any kind of reasoning and discourse, we need to conceive identifiable and trackable entities with clear properties. I think this is the real business of metaphysics. And metaphysics in this sense cannot be avoided, so it just needs to be done as well as possible. And what I would like to do is articulate good pragmatist ways of doing this kind of metaphysics. Any empirical statements we can make are about some presumed entities, hormones, electrons, proteins, gross national product, COVID, whatever. They are not pure reports of sensation within oneself. I think that's a point that we've all come to recognize. So I see pragmatist metaphysics as the business of building good ontologies that will support coherent activities. It is commonly thought that pragmatism, like positivism, should avoid metaphysics altogether or somehow dissolve it into something non-metaphysical. But I don't think that's the most productive view to take. Under my conception of what reality means, actually the enterprise of pragmatist metaphysics doesn't sound so far from the realist conception of metaphysics, which we can take from someone like Kit Fine here, who says the aim of realist metaphysics is to render the world intelligible in terms of the distinction between what is and what is not real. And its task is complete once it becomes clear how what is apparent or not real is to be rendered intelligible in terms of what is real. So I could actually sign up to that vision of metaphysics as long as we can mean by real what I mean, not what Kit Fine means. Having a good operational ontology is crucial for any kind of cognitive activity. This point has received a new recognition in the so-called data-centric sciences, such as genomics or proteomics, as, for example, discussed by Sabina Leonelli's recent Lactos Award-winning book. Similarly, many years ago now, I was delighted to meet a computer scientist at a conference whose business card, which he gave me, proudly bore his job title of Chief Ontologist for his firm. Ontology is a well-established technical concept in his field, and so it should be in every field of research. And if you would go on to LinkedIn today and just randomly search for chief ontologist, there are many, many people in the world who have that job title now. Well, without an ontology, we cannot say anything intelligible, make any kind of analysis, or engage with nature and society in any specific and directed ways. So there is something fundamentally right about hacking again. Realism concerning entities is prior to any realism that we can have concerning the truth of the statements that we make about the entities in question. If the entities that we speak and think about were not real, it wouldn't make any sense to maintain that the statements we make about them are true, or even not true. It is necessary for us to grapple with ontology if we are to talk about truth. Now, in science and other empirical realms of life, the challenging ontological task is to create concepts that specify real entities or realities. This is what we should aspire to do, unless there are particular reasons to take fictionalist or instrumentalist attitudes in some particular situations. This, to me, is the spirit of realism. Identifying the realities that we should be dealing with is a crucial part of any process of inquiry. And concept making is just not a matter of thinking up ideas. For concepts intended to specify real things, their uses have to involve coherent arrangements of material and social settings. And this task of concept creation cannot be avoided, because concepts are not simply handed to us by God or through an intuitive access to Platonic heaven. And yes, we have our inborn instincts, but they're not sufficient to give us good concepts in most novel situations, such as those encountered at the cutting edge of modern science. So again, successful concept building is an engineering process in which we fashion realities which are not subject to mind control, but amenable to our understanding and engagement. So what I'm advocating here under the label of pragmatist metaphysics is a modest and piecemeal practice of naturalistic metaphysics, not giving a grand view of how the world is, arising from abstract reflections removed from experience, but allowing our knowledge of ontology to grow from well-established practices. It makes sense to take ontological lessons from our most successful scientific practices, in the spirit of Nancy Cartwright's work, for example. This is different from naturalism, as it is often meant, which tries to mold metaphysics directly in line with the propositional content of accepted scientific theories or their currently favored interpretations. No, I think we learn best about real things by seeing how we can create operationally coherent activities. Solid ontological lessons are more likely to emerge from the experience of experimental practices rather than listening to theorists uncritically. Scientists are seriously engaged in the business of crafting new and better concepts that support coherent activities, and also creating new situations of doing and thinking in which the realities that designated by the concepts do their work. And this, I think, is why we need to listen respectfully to the scientist when we do metaphysics. As C.I. Lewis once put it in his discussion of Dewey, salvation is through work. And philosophers should certainly pay attention to scientific work. So it makes sense for philosophers to have respect for the undoubted ingenuity and sustained efforts of scientists when we try to get a sense of what is real and what isn't real. But doing naturalist metaphysics should also not mean a renunciation of philosophical judgment or responsibility. Scientists do not always work as well as they could or should. Scientific theoreticians, especially, often make unwarranted pronouncements upon the nature of reality, which are often regarded with suspicion by many of their experimentalist colleagues. And entire scientific communities may enter into uncritical kind of groupthink, preventing the emergence of more coherent alternatives. Consider, for example, the central dogma of molecular genetics that held back considerations of epigenetic inheritance, or the uncritical acceptance of Newtonian absolute space and time. So philosophers can and should ask critical questions concerning the reality of the items found in current scientific ontology. And metaphysics, as I see it, is a collaborative enterprise between science and philosophy. So let me stop there. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Hasok, and I'm sure everyone in attendance is joining me in thanking Professor Chang for a wonderful talk. And without further ado, we move on to the Q&A. If you'd like to raise any questions, by all means, please go ahead by using your virtual hand. I already see two hands. First, Mr. Javier Poveda Figueroa, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Hasok, for your talk. It was very interesting. Fine, thanks. It's nice to see you, Hasok.
To see you, yeah.
So I was wondering, in that sense, if there's some kind of mathematical or logical way of handling, you know, the concept that you are explaining to us. I mean, not necessarily like in the idealist way that you generate any kind of concepts from abstraction, as you said, but mainly more in mathematical and logical way, more in the tradition, I don't know if you would say Russell or Frege. So I am thinking if it's possible to incorporate these issues here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm afraid I'm not going to have a good answer to your question. If anyone can formalize the thoughts I'm expressing here, that would be to the good, I think. The difficulty I see in that prospect is something I didn't go fully into today, which is the fact that according to my conception, reality as well as truth comes out as a matter of degrees, right? And not a simple matter of 0 to 1 either, right? And this is because the fundamental concept I use, namely operational coherence, itself is it's a quality. It's not something you can easily measure. It's at least multidimensional, right? Partly, right, just to give you one sense of the difficulty, operational coherence is increased if what you do fits more precisely with each other. It's also increased if you can do your activity in more situations, right? So if the domain increases, the coherence increases. If the precision increases, the coherence increases. It's also a matter of the mutual adjustment of aims and means, and there are so many aspects of this notion that I gave up on trying to make it formalized or quantitative, but that's not to say that it couldn't be done or that it wouldn't be good to do it. I just myself don't see how it could be done.
All right, thanks so much, Javier and Hasok, for answering. Next up, we have a question from soon-to-be Dr. Ovidio Babish. Ovidio, please go ahead.
Don't be so sure, hopefully. Yeah, thank you, Hasok, very much. So I'm not sure if this is really relevant to your talk, but say we're like, you know, I'm a historian of science who's like hardworking and really trying to understand, you know, 17th century, 18th century science. Now, the way I see it, your concept of operational coherence, right, we should be able to apply it to past science, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Which is to say, we should be able to apply it to dead practices, as it were. So, right. And then I wonder, how do you kind of judge the operational coherence of dead practices? Because I see at least several layers. Because on the one hand, the practices are kind of indexed by, the culture in which they're done, right? So, better than me. Pre-Lavoisier, people were making a big case of phlogiston, and they were measuring it and conceptualizing it in all sorts of ways. And that's one way of putting it. So the community was kind of trying to have some sort of coherence vis-a-vis this entity, which is phlogiston, right? That's one layer. But then there's the other layer. So, if you really zoom in on, individual past scientists, you really, you can discover that, people weren't doing the right thing, even assuming that the practice itself was coherent as a whole. So, they weren't measuring it properly. They didn't have the right ontology, as it were, for this type of. So I was just asking about some general comment about what do you see the layers of like dead practices and past science.
Yeah. Thank you, Ovidiu. Well, I specialize in dead practices. So, and the whole notion of operational coherence came out of my thinking about the history of science. So the immediate thing to say is that operational coherence is judged with respect to the aims of the activity in question, right? And the aims in the first instance are the aims of the practitioners themselves, right? And then there's another layer in which we, the observers, try to evaluate the values of the aims. So it's a bit like instrumental rationality, right? So you can say that, yes, this was a very effective way of doing a terrible thing. So it's a bit like that with operational coherence as well. But there are many layers, as you say, because you can also ask, right, how is the coherence of the whole system of practice, right? How does this individual activity fit in with the other activities we do and the overall aims of the system that we might have? And you can imagine layers and layers of this all the way to the meaning of life. So, but in the first instance, it's quite possible to discern the operational coherence of dead practices according to what they were trying to achieve. So I look at Priestley with his phlogiston and wow, he could really achieve his aims very well, right? So he wanted to make different kinds of gases, did that very well using phlogiston as a tool. He wanted to use phlogiston as a tool for studying other phenomena such as respiration and even photosynthesis, and that worked out well. So in that first order sense, yeah, there was a great deal of coherence there. But I'm sure there'll be more questions coming from people about operational coherence, so let me stop there.
All right, thanks so much, Ovidiu, for the question, and Hasok for answering. Next up, we have a question from Professor Dushalo. Dana, please go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, Ovidiu has already asked the first part of the question, so I'm trying to address then your answer, Hasok, to this.
Yes.
What are the implications for the historian of science who works with events, historical evidence, things like this? So what are the ontological commitments that the historian does in order to assess, first of all, identify the objects of his reconstructions and then to assess their reality, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question, right? Which I'm glad you raised, because it is also something I worry about when I'm working as a historian. So let me say, one thing I want to avoid, and then I'll try to say something more positive. What I want to avoid is that argument which came from Latour saying that the ancient Egyptians couldn't have died from tuberculosis because the concept hadn't been invented. And I think that was a silly debate, and I think we can handle it in the way I was trying to sketch a response to the past objection, right? Objection from the past. No, it is perfectly cogent for us to say that these Ramses or whoever it was died from tuberculosis with our activities of diagnosis and explanation and even treatment. Okay, so I want to avoid that kind of arguments, but the historian is going to be faced with a dual task, right? One is to figure out the ontology held by the historical actors, right? Which we figure out by studying their activities and first of all, going from what they say is real and not real and how that matches up with their activities. So that I think is the most straightforward part. But then at least some of us in doing history of science cannot help asking the questions phrased in modern terms, right? So, you know, we might ask, what was Priestley actually handling in these experiments? We might ask, right, so, you know, should we say that the epicycles were real in the coherence systems of Ptolemaic astronomy? And I think what I think we have to accept is a kind of pluralism that I like to apply to past science, to ourselves as well, so that our historical retrospect informed by modern conceptions is a valid view as much as the actor's own points of view. And I mean, what are the actor's own points of view? That's always interpreted by us anyway, to the extent that we can intelligibly talk about it. So I think there are inevitably going to be layers of interpretations and associated ontologies going with the interpretations. And I think we need to, first of all, accept that there will be pluralities of ontologies. And then I don't think it becomes such a vexing problem for the historian. But I'm not sure if I got to the core of your question, Dana. We can come back to it if I haven't.
Yeah, no, I think you did. But then, so you are happy with the fact that we are dealing with fluctuating ontologies, and yes, the historian has this as a supplementary problem.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it is always going to be a problem, right? We're going to have to deal with, I think. And the ontology is going to be fluctuating and multiple. And I mean, I've become quite content with that myself. I know many people are not.
Feel this as a bit of a threat for the historian. Doing metaphysics.
Right. No, I don't think it should be, but I can see why. Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much, Dana, for the question. Hasok for answering. Next up, we have a question from Uzma Mali. Uzma, please go.
Hi, Hasok. Thank you very much for the talk. Basically, what you just said of fluctuating ontologies, I'd like to ask us a converse question: is like, how far can ontology go? How far can coherent activities go in terms of creating a capital R for reality? I mean, if we look at pluralism as the guiding light for ontological theorizing, what can be said to be the aim of scientific theorizing? What can be said to be the aim of these operational coherent activities as an activity, as scientific practice?
Right. So short answer I would give is that the aim of science is learning, right? Which is a bit different from saying that it is the truth, right? So the aim is learning, and what we want is progress, meaning more and more learning. And where I would begin to really diverge from certain metaphysical realists is when I say learning comes in all kinds of different ways. And one of the ways of learning, as Hacking would emphasize, is to create more stuff and more phenomena that we didn't have before. I would add with Feierabend, another way of learning is to come up with a new way of understanding the same phenomena, right? And of course, there are the more standard ways of learning, like collecting more facts and increasing the precision of what we know, and right, increasing conceptual coherence. So I think what my kind of framework reveals is that, yeah, there are really multiple ways of learning and making progress in science. So that's that would be my short answer to your question.
Okay, thank you.
Huge question, short answer.
So true. Thanks so much, Uzma and Hasok, for answering. Next up, we have a question from Wilhelm. Please go ahead.
Okay. First, thank you again for a talk, which was great in my perception, really great.
Thank you.
Because I, as far as my knowledge goes, and my knowledge in history of science is not comparable, but as far as my knowledge goes, I share many of these opinions, while I would not call myself a pragmatist. I would agree in the direction of instrumentalism, operationalism, constructivism. While I am so convinced that this is a very good direction where your talk goes, I want to be the advocatus diaboli in one point.
Yeah.
And this refers to your foil number 16. Mind, dependence, and so on. Excuse me a moment. Okay, I could agree, or would agree, as even in a Kantian sense, that we have a mind-framed reality, but not mind-dependent. Okay, but in my view, this is not just enough, because we have the point of the resistance of reality to false assumptions. My example is extremely simple. Would mankind have ended in, say, the 13th century, Anno Domini, the fixed stars might have been what their name says. The fixed stars would have been fixed stars. Sorry. So that's a simple example, but I think I made my point clear. And this is my question. Have you, and it's an unfair question because Kant himself did not answer, what is it? What makes, gives us the chance to falsify our assumptions? But any account of truth and reality, I think, should, in a sense, respect this as a task. Thank you. That's my question.
Yeah. If I understood you correctly, I mean, I'm very much interested in incorporating this sense of resistance from reality into my way of thinking. And how it comes out is that so this is more in the truth chapter than the reality one, which I gave you today. How it goes is, if our assumptions are false, then we will fail to make coherent activities on the basis of them, right? But it's not quite as simple as that sounds, because again, I'm making a semantic move there, defining truth in terms of the ability of a proposition to support coherent activities. But where the resistance comes in is the same as the classical pragmatist saw it when William James, for example, poetically said, reality has a habit of boiling over, right? So yes, we can plan things according to our assumptions, and then they will go wrong if our assumptions are not good. So I think in my mind, that's sufficient to incorporate the notion of objectivity and the relevant sense of mind independence. But I understand that may not be sufficient.
It would, last short reply, in my view, it would be if you would account for the objectivity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is what I'm trying to achieve.
Say, my access in this single point is an access from a logical point of view, from a formal logical point of view, but this is another discussion. But it's in my view, would be complementary and compatible with everything else here. Thank you very much.
I see, thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Wilhelm, for the question, and Hasok for answering. With Ovidio's permission, if I may, I would just like to abuse my privilege as a chair and ask a question of my own. And so, Hasok, this is very much half-baked, but let me quote one of my favorite authors. And it goes like this, quote, "Even when we only consider the enhancement of one given epistemic virtue, there may be different ways of achieving it, and more than one way of achieving it equally well. We're often led away from this pluralistic recognition by an obsession with truth, because mutually incompatible systems of knowledge cannot all be true. The achievement of other virtues is not so exclusive." And then we go on to specify explanatory power, quantitative precision, and so on. And then later on, all in all, the coherentist method of epistemic iteration points to a pluralistic traditionalism. Each line of inquiry needs to take place within a tradition, but the researcher is ultimately not confined to the choice of one tradition. And each tradition can give rise to many competing lines of development. Now, as some of you might have fathomed,
that sounds like something I said.
One of my favorite authors that I've been quoting from extensively is Hasok Chang, page 232 of Inventing Temperature. This is absolutely fantastic. I think that's all true. Okay, but then it seems to me that the talk you've given now, so I'm just pitting Hasok Chang against Hasok Chang, right? So it seems to me that the talk you've given now goes beyond that in two important ways. One way is that we're no longer talking a la William Alston, say, in this kind of combo of different epistemic virtues, whatever they may be. You're talking about operationalist coherentism, right? So there's a coherence between methods of making a given concept operational. Okay, this is an important and massive restriction, right? And secondly, you're no longer talking about epistemic value or epistemic virtue, something that might say drive given scientific project or anything like that. We're talking about what's real, right? And this seems to me once again an important step in the development of your project, right? And so you've given persuasive reasons, I think, to question the kind of old-fashioned metaphysical realism in scientific contexts but I guess I to my ear at least, and perhaps I've just, please correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't heard what the main lines were for these two specific steps, and perhaps I mean, you've said some things to address the science to reality step, right? Yeah, but it seems to me, so just to take one simple example, if we think of say psychometrics, right? There's this notion of construct validity. This is meant to measure the exact distance between, epistemic value and what we take to be sort of operationable. What we take to be able to be made operational in some sense. I blank on the participle there, but the idea there seems to be that we cherish, we wish, and not just the general community, but the scientists engaged in those projects themselves seem to favor specific combos of epistemic virtues, and those might or might not be reducible to anything that could be operational. And so I'm just wondering, what you think about this. This is very much half-baked, but yeah.
No, it's not at all half-baked, and it's quite interesting, right? I mean, in a way, I'm surprised that I said as much as that 18 years ago. But as you point out, it's different from what I now say. And without fully being able to answer your questions, let me point out two things that might help. One is that, as you noticed, I was trying to get away from this obsession with truth that philosophers have. That's because I hadn't worked out this pragmatist notion of truth, which I now can very happily talk about, right? So I think that's how I build what I'm now proposing as a kind of realism, right? Because I do want to talk about truth and reality and how we get at them, but conceived in this pragmatist way. So the separation between the aim of truth and other epistemic virtues has become much less clear than it was for me 18 years ago. So that's one thing. The other thing to point out is that the idea of operational coherence incorporates some of the key epistemic virtues, but not all of them, or not entirely, right? So, yes, you would have more coherence if you have more scope, for example, as I mentioned. It certainly would have more coherence if you have more accuracy coming out, and so on. But the question becomes complicated if you ask about things like simplicity or fruitfulness, to pick from Kuhn's list, right? Because fruitfulness certainly isn't part of the snapshot of operational coherence, but it's something that we want in terms of an ideal of progressivism, right? So there, right, I'm regrouping things, as it were, rather than having, all sorts of virtues which people are free to pursue.
And if I may very quickly add, perhaps explanatory power is also on that list.
Explanatory power is very complicated, right? Partly because philosophers don't have an agreed sense of what the hell that means. Right? So, again, I'm trying to absorb some of it into this notion of coherence, but there's the rest of it. And then there are, of course, non-epistemic virtues as well that come into the picture. And then virtues like simplicity, which may be epistemic, may not be epistemic, right? Maybe just a matter of convenience. So where does that sort of thing sit? Well, I would say not with truth, if it's just convenience, right? So there's a lot of rearranging and refocusing to do, which is partly done in the book, forthcoming book, partly left undone, and it's a future task. And I mean, just so you have a slightly more complete picture, in the chapter on truth, what I do is actually a bit more complicated than what I do in the reality chapter, because I'm with people who call themselves truth pluralists as well. Well, what they mean by that is there are many things we mean by truth, all of which are relevant in philosophy. And so what I do in that chapter is say, I'm proposing a notion of what I call truth by operational coherence. A clumsy phrase, but it just indicates what it is. And I'm saying that's the most important kind of truth in the empirical realm. But, you know, if you're doing pure logic, there's another sense of truth, which becomes very important. If you're doing something else, right? I mean, definitions will have a different kind of truth to empirical truth. So I think it's important to recognize that complex landscape concerning truth, but what I call truth by operational coherence works very much like the notion of reality I'm proposing here. So there again, right, you'll see how the sort of amorphous list of epistemic virtues become regrouped and refocused into truth and some other things, but more complicated because truth in this sense and truth in other senses, as well as other virtues. Okay, I'll shut up now.
All right, thanks so much for that. That's really helpful, and I think that entices us all to read the book. Let me give way now to Ovidiu, who I believe had another question. So please go ahead. Thanks so much, Hasok.
Yeah, thank you, Andrei. So I'm sure it's been addressed. So it was kind of a middle way between your question, Andrei, and a follow-up to Dana's point. So I'm sure there's no use to asking it again. But now I want to ask just this: when is the book coming out?
Hopefully sometime in the summer. So the final version of the manuscript is with the press, and they are copy editing the text, and they sent me the cover, but not the main text. So it'll be a few weeks more with the copy editing and then the proofs. So the index is already done. Right? This is a new method, index done on the electronic file. So the page numbers will just be automatically generated at the end. Yeah, so hopefully by the end of the summer, but they don't tell me. They make no promises about the timing.
So since Ovidiu is being so cautious, I just wanted to ask a quick follow-up to my own question, sort of pointing at the relationships that might go on between Hasok the young and Hasok the middle, right? I'm thinking perhaps you mentioned this was very nice. So I'm wondering if a truth pluralist, this is what you said you endorse. This is what, in some sense, affords the pragmatist conception of reality that has epistemic value sort of latch onto one of the several possible construals of truth, right? Whereas a truth monist, say, someone who construes truth on a model of correspondence to reality or whatever that may be, is going to say the kinds of things you were saying in 2004, right? And so is going to divorce epistemic value and the kind of research and context-specific combo of what's fruitful to advance science from truth as correspondence. Is that right? So is that the kind of connection here?
That is, I mean, that's right, if I understood you correctly. Let me say two things that might help clarify the picture. So with my truth pluralism, I mean, I am saying that the traditional correspondence notion of truth it's not meaningless. We can understand what that means. I just don't think it's very useful in most contexts. But it's coherent. You can have that one if you want, but there's very little you can do with that. So that's one thing to say. And the other is that, well, that's a bit similar to the big R notion of reality, right? Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to declare that there's no such thing or it's meaningless, but I'm just asking, like a pragmatist, what can we do with that idea? What does it help us do? And my sense is there are very precious few activities, even mental ones, that you can usefully do with these notions of truth and reality. And I'm saying that, but look, I mean, these notions that we do have in everyday life of truth and reality, which people use day in and day out. And we'd be really sad if we couldn't say things like what Donald Trump just said is not true, right? We would be very sad if we couldn't say God is out of touch with reality. So I'm saying let's hold on to these meanings that are really useful, and let's see how our philosophical notions can connect with them and approach them, rather than having some philosophical kind of truth that's entirely disconnected from what people normally mean by truth, right? So that's partly in J.L. Austin's spirit again, where he said, yes, in daily life, we say things like, oh, that's true enough, or very true. Which would be nonsense according to the traditional notion of truth. And that true enough phrase has now been picked up by Catherine Elgin, who has brought it back into circulation in a slightly different way, right? So that's what I'm trying to achieve. There are really useful concepts of truth and reality in daily life, in ordinary language, in scientific practice. Why don't we do the philosophical job of clarifying and sharpening what those things are?
All right, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And I promise this is the last follow-up I ask. Suppose you had this fictional character who proposed the following argument and said something like this, you know, a successful, progressive, justified, best practices, best standards, scientific project would promote some kind of combo of epistemic values, be it explanatory power, predictive power, problem-solving power, accuracy, whatever, right? Some kind of combo of these things. If you want, call them jointly, just label that thing coherence, okay? And presumably that's going to satisfy some probabilistic constraints. Whether those are objective or subjective is a different matter, but you know, just call that coherence. And then you have a second premise, knowledge as ability, or knowledge as a constellation of abilities. When we know something, if we really know it, we know how to act on it. We know how to, in some sense, use it, right? And then conclusion, you'd have this kind of operational coherence, right? So not just coherence, but something we can sort of bank on, something we can use fruitfully to advance our projects, right? So suppose we had that fictional character proposing this kind of sort of ready-made argument, as it were. could you, in just a couple of words, sort of say sort of how you depart from that, or what? So I'm supposing that there's a lot of differences between the view you've just advanced and that kind of fictional character, but there are also there's also some similarity, and so I'm just hoping that it might be useful for.
I mean, I may not need to depart so much from that fictional character, right? I mean, I think your fictional character in a way is expressing the same kind of ideas in a slightly different way. But there is one thing I should note, which, I mean, it would cause me to give a whole other talk, which I won't, but I want to mention it. Because of the way the concept of operational coherence is basically configured, it can incorporate all kinds of values. Why? Because operational coherence is defined by reference to one's aims in a given activity, right? So there would be a way of building in any values you've got into the aim, right? I don't think people normally do that, but if a philosopher would insist, right, they can say, my aim is to make the most fruitful theory. And then there would be an activity of theorizing, trying to do that, right? And then there would be operational coherence of that activity. So that would be kind of a device through which you can work in any kind of value into operational coherence. Now, so that's a problem. I mean, I don't think it's a problem, actually. It's something I haven't thought completely through, but what I'm more concerned about is to see how that kind of thing does work out in actual historical activities or current ones, right, where people do have clear values that drive their activities. And then, at least in our interpretation, we can say, right, oh, okay, we look at both Copernicus and the Ptolemaic astronomers. Gosh, they were driven by a kind of ideal of beauty, weren't they? This obsession with uniform circular motions and so on. And that seems to have been part of their aim, right? To make a formal system that accounts for observed planetary motions in these very constrained, aesthetically pleasing geometries, right? So that's a particular activity which they excelled at, and there's coherence in that, and that coherence embodies that kind of value. But that's tricky territory, right? Because first of all, again, that's an interpretive step we're taking, that sort of thing wasn't so clearly articulated, right? But I think, okay, that's where history of science becomes just hard. We have to work hard in the face of uncertainty to make the best interpretations. But I think we see in those kinds of situations, values getting embedded, right, into activities, and therefore as an inherent part of operational coherence.
All right, thank you so much. I'm very grateful that that's really helpful. It simply didn't occur to me that, you know, we could pack into
you can package anything.
Yeah. and because that's so different from the kind of Bridgman operationalism that
that's right.
That's amazing. All right, thanks so much. And we have, I very much realize it's quite late, but we have a final comment from Uzma, please go ahead.
Okay, this is a really quick question. It might be a bit naive as well. Most people can say that knowledge how can be collapsed into knowledge that, and vice versa, and knowledge that can be collapsed into knowledge how. I was wondering, and you situate knowledge that in knowledge how, or at least that's what you imply.
Yeah, that is what I said.
I was wondering about your motivation for doing that. I mean, that seems to me very basic at the very base of your theory, where operation coherentism is defined in terms of knowledge how and stuff. So why knowledge how?
Right. I mean, that's going to be...
and not as opposed to knowledge that, as opposed to the collapse between knowledge how and knowledge that, for instance.
Right. So there are two things to say briefly. One is, why I pay so much attention to knowledge how to begin with. And that is, tied up with why I worry about what I'm calling active knowledge. It's the same thing, right? And that's explained in the introduction in chapter 1 of the book. The short version of it is because I'm trying to make a philosophy of science fit for understanding scientific practice. And I just cannot do that job, especially when I'm doing history of science, with this usual notion that knowledge is propositional, that you just have knowledge that. And then how do we... It's very awkward and difficult to make sense of the kinds of learning that we see so clearly in the history of science, things like all the learning of methodologies, right? I mean, that's a really important part of scientific progress and very difficult to express in terms of what propositions we've learned the truth of, right? So that's the initial motivation for going into knowledge how. And then there's the question you raised about the relationship between knowledge how and
the status of knowledge how.
Yeah. So there are lots of analytic philosophers who are trying to reduce knowledge how to knowledge that. And that move I resist. There's a little bit of that in the book, but it's a whole discourse in itself, right? I mean, one thing I can say briefly is very often what those philosophers do is to say, yeah, well, no, we can certainly describe how something is done. And that description is going to be propositional. So knowing how is just a species of knowing that. But Gilbert Ryle already, I think, anticipated that kind of thing. And the point is not saying how something is done, but actually knowing how to do it, right? Which is where everything from tacit knowledge to traditions of practice come in, right? So, there are things like the examples that these people love, like the armless pianist, right? You may know that one. Accomplished pianist who goes to war and loses his arms. Does he still know how to play the piano? And all right, yeah, he can still say how it's done, but no, he can't play the piano anymore because the knowledge how is, I mean, in a less facetious way, that's embodied, right? The actual knowing how to do it. It's not just a matter of trying to say how it's done, which would be actually impossible anyway. But without your arms, no, you don't know how to play the piano. So there are that kind of considerations which push me away from the sort of reduction. And then in the other direction, there's the question of why don't I try to reduce knowledge that to knowledge how? And that's because I think, I mean, propositional knowledge is a very different thing from active knowledge. And it would be foolish, I think, on my part to try to say, no, there is no such thing really as propositional knowledge. It's all a matter of knowing how. No, first of all, because they belong to different kinds of things, right? Activities versus propositions, and propositions do have their own qualities, right? One of which is truth, or however you define it. And so then what I try to do is, instead of trying to reduce knowledge that directly to knowledge how, what I try to do is to understand truth of this kind in terms of operational coherence and the knowledge how that's associated with the activities. So that's why I say I want to understand how knowledge that operates within knowledge how.
Isn't that kind of a reduction though?
Not exactly a reduction, right? Because reduction implies that once you've contextualized that, you can get rid of it.
Yeah, sure.
So I don't want to go there, but you know, there are points that Gilbert Ryle already made, like, well, I mean, to have any knowledge that you need to have language, you need to know how to use language. And we all know that, you know, takes at least 2 years for human babies to master that skill. So it's not trivial to know how to learn, speak and use language in order to understand and express any knowing that. And you can't teach language just with language, right? It's going to involve, right, skills starting with pointing and naming and all that stuff. So, I mean, that's an active area of research among cognitive scientists, right? So I think all of that tells me that knowledge that really needs to be understood in the context of what we do.
Okay.
And yeah, that may be generally the case about thinking, right? And who was it who said the brain is primarily a motor organ? It's all embedded in what we do in the world, right?
Well, I'm blanking out on the quote here. It seems to me that I have a comment from Carmen. She suggested Annie Clark is the one who.
Oh yes. Yeah, that sounds right. And
that's right.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Carmen. Saving the day. And thanks so much, Uzma, for the question, and Hasok for answering. Professor Chang, stellar as usual. This is
a pleasure.
Absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for being with us. We hope to have you with us again very soon, hopefully face to face. But at the very least, in this kind of remote circumstance. So we're very grateful once again. Congrats on your new book. I'm still wondering about the connection between this and your old book, but please join me in thanking Professor Chang once again for his talk.
Thank you, everyone.
And with all due gratitude, thank you and have a good night.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.